so on and so forth. And the most shocking thing about all this for me was that the majority of the people who got infected did not need to receive any kind of treatment before they recovered. And yet the whole world has been in extreme difficulties. So if the lesson for me is that if a thing like the pandemic could drive the world into such a crisis, could suddenly appear, how about other things that we've known for many years that are going the wrong direction? Well, how come we are not responding to those things? Why are we willfully ignoring things like habitat loss, like biodiversity erosion, climate crisis? As much as meetings are being held year after year after year, we're still behaving as if the impact will come in 1 million years and not already here with us. And so the lesson for me is that human beings are very capable of ignoring the obvious and waiting until they're overtaken by things that maybe they were not fully expecting. And the other thing is that among the causes of the pandemic itself, there's been a very flippant way of dismissing certain scenario because we don't want to be seen as conspirators or people who pursue conspiracy theories. So rather than investigating every idea about what could have been the source and what's the best way to respond to it, people just quickly yield themselves into believing that one answer fits it all. And I think that's a very big lesson, that in a complex world, as citizens, as beings sharing the planet with other beings, other species, we need to look at things more holistically and look at all the complexities of situations. So, Ashish,
I think, yeah, Nnimmo, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I'm glad you've said that because, I mean, I could build on that. Add maybe a couple of points, which is that I think what the pandemic has shown us is one, a massive rift between us and the rest of nature. And you've already touched on that, so I won't go into that in detail. But I think it's really shown us that we cannot be playing around with the rest of nature in the sort of cavalier fashion that we've been doing for the last few centuries. Because at some point or the other, it does hit back on us. We don't know the exact, I mean, the jury is still out on the exact origin of the virus, but whatever it is, it's clear that playing around with nature has been part of that cause. And the second, I think, very crucial lesson is that economic globalization is a recipe for disaster. You know, the virus had such a enjoyable free ride all over the world because of the fact that human beings and materials are zipping around the world at breakneck speed in the name of economic globalization. Otherwise, there's no way that you could have such a rapid spread. And also, the same economic globalization has created a sort of a huge amount of vulnerability amongst hundreds of millions of people. Probably the majority of the world's population is in some way or the other vulnerable to crises. There's a precarious situation, especially those who are most closest to the land, who are industrial workers, who are basically working with their hands, who were the worst affected. Of course, some people benefited a lot. Billionaires became multi-billionaires in the process, but for the majority of people, this became it still is a massive economic shock apart from the health shock. So I think there's at least many of us who've been already asking questions about economic globalization might find it a bit easier now to find a bigger audience to listen with regard to this fundamental questioning of what is development itself. If we don't go into that fundamental question, what is human well-being, what is development, unless we question the hegemony of Western modernist development in the way that it's been imposed all over the world, I think we're in for one crisis after the other. This pandemic will go away, another one will come, climate crisis, financial crisis, one thing after the other. And it's going to impact the most vulnerable people the most, and of course, the rest of nature.
Maybe following up directly from that, what would be the elements that need to be addressed in terms of questioning development, sustainable development, to move forward in that sense beyond the critique itself?
Well, we can come to the alternatives. Nnimmo, if it's okay, I'll go first now, and then I think we can do this alternating. So we can come to the alternatives in a bit, Philippe, but I think it's important to also go a little bit deeper into what is the crisis of development. Why are we where we are? And it seems to me that there are multiple dimensions to it, and obviously in a short time, one can only go do a bit of a simplistic assessment. But number one, this fetish of economic growth, which every country in the world except Bhutan has accepted as being the indicator of development. Even this whole notion that some countries are developed and others are developing or underdeveloped is something that came out of post-World War II attempt by Europe and North America to re-establish their economies by creating this myth that the only way the rest of the world is going to be doing okay is to follow our path of industrialization and more and more material consumption, more and more material and energy flows and things like that. And that's why economic growth became the god that it is. And unless we fundamentally question that and ask ourselves, how do we do well? How do we live well? Not about how do we grow economically and materially and energy-wise and all, but how do we live well in a way that doesn't trash the earth and doesn't create the incredible amounts of inequalities. We are, Philippe, Nnimmo, you already know this, we are living in the most unequal ever society in history right now, right? With what, 10 billionaires having as much wealth as 50% of the world's population. This is simply not sustainable. It's not socially sustainable. It's not ecologically sustainable. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But with this god of economic growth, that is going to continue. So we have to challenge this linear way of thinking of developed, underdeveloped, etc. The centrality of GDP as an indicator of development and well-being. All of that has to be challenged. What are the alternatives? We will, I think, I'll certainly want to come back to that in a bit. Nnimmo?
Absolutely, I fully agree with you, because the idea of development is something that has captured the imagination of the world, and I think it's also a product of the imagination itself. Imagining that humans can take whatever we want from nature, can transform whatever we want to transform in nature. We can make nature more efficient. We can make nature more nature than itself, that we know more than nature, as if we are standing apart from nature and view nature as an object that we can commodify, and everything is measured by money. It gets so annoying when I hear people say that nobody's going to take care of the environment except they know the monetary value of the environment. And so you have people talk about payment for environmental services, payment for this or that, carbon offsetting, carbon trading, and everything must be brought down to dollars or to naira or to whatever measure, a financial measure. Forgetting also that even money itself is fiction. It's product of imagination. It's just a story. When I was growing up, the currency note we're using in my country had this label on it: the Central Bank of Nigeria promises to pay so amount. So it was just a promise. And I found that, but I think about it, I think it's very interesting that the bank promised to pay without paying anything. And then people are killing themselves over destroying the environment to accumulate cash, to accumulate these pieces of paper that is just used to make us feel as though we have some value in something. And so rather than taking just enough of what nature freely gives us, what nature gives us for living, we want to grab everything. And this grabbing accumulation, transformation of nature so as to accumulate capital has really ruined the entire world. And I believe one of the first step for us to recover is not by following the so-called sustainable pathways. I mean, sustainable in the sense, sustainable has been bastardized. People don't really know what it means. Even very polluting corporations produce sustainability reports. And if they're in the forefront of publishing this very glossy report, so that sustainability doesn't mean what it ought to mean. And for me, I prefer to put a hyphen between the sustainability. It's a sustainability. So let's try to sustain an ability to live well, to live in harmony with nature, ability to reconnect to Mother Earth, and not just believe that, well, if I destroy in one place, I can make good what I'm destroying somewhere else. And my damage in Nigeria is offset by my good in the United States of America. All this kind of logic and program, so-called progress, something that needs to be overturned. And unless we wake up from the slumber, wake up from this fiction, there's no way we're going to change things. It has to change from the imagination. What do we imagine to be the way forward, and what is the way we can relate with each other, and not fighting about, not having so much conflict. Ashish, you mentioned conflict. You know, wars are being waged tonight in today's world just to secure resources, to secure energy sources, especially oil and gas, as something that's destroying the world, that's destroying the climate. Is still capable of refueling wars in the world, and it shows that something is dramatically wrong with humans.
Yeah, Nnimmo, I think you mentioned sustainability. It's really important, as you're doing, is to sort of interrogate this word itself, and especially sustainable development. So Philippe, you mentioned sustainable development. No? So we have the Sustainable Development Goals 2015 onwards, and everybody is very happy with that. But if you really examine it properly, there's such incredible and fundamental contradictions that you have all of those goals for sustainable consumption, production, equality, women's empowerment, etc., all of which sounds great. But then you also have one of the goals which says increase economic growth. And you also have, you actually don't have some of the most fundamental transformations that are required in governance, in the way the economy is envisioned, is imagined and handled. So SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, and sustainable development in general, to my mind, is one of those oxymorons. It's a contradiction in terms. You cannot have continuous economic and material and energy throughput and flow increasing and call it sustainable on a finite planet. That is just an impossibility. But also we see that what the currently dominant system is giving us are very seductive narratives. Sustainable development is one of them. There's many others. Right now, there's net zero carbon. There's net zero biodiversity loss. It's like this whole net thing, which means that exactly what Nnimmo said. You can keep destroying in one part of the earth, but just, plant more trees somewhere else or do something else, capture that carbon somewhere else. But the incredible impacts of continuing high emissions or continuing high rates of biodiversity loss, while maybe trying to sort of plant trees somewhere else, that's not being considered. And I think we really have to challenge these superficial or false solutions that the system is giving us, and ask ourselves really what are the fundamental, like Nnimmo said, the mind shifts, and I would say the heart shifts. And what would that mean? I mean, what would that actually mean, which we can get into a bit later in the program. Philippe, back to you.
Okay, so maybe it's a good point at which to start focusing more on the environmental dimension. So if we look at the broader ecological crisis within which we are, and that's beyond COVID, obviously, maybe we could discuss a little bit of what are the issues that you would put first in terms of needing attention, and within that, the two sub-issues that you may decide to address individually or both. One was in terms of whether it is a science and technology-led model which has caused the kind of problems we are facing in terms of moving away from cooperative, humane modes of interaction with the environment. And the second thing is whether recent court rulings against oil and mining global corporations are one of the things that possibly will take us towards a different imagination of what the future might be.
Thank you. Let me jump into that. That's a very broad picture that you've just painted for us, but it's also nice that we can pick chunks, pieces of it. One of the things, let me preface my contribution by saying that one of the things that has really affected the responses to the environmental crisis is the fact that our policymakers have ignored the voices from the ground, voices from below. There's not been enough listening to the people who are the front lines of who are being impacted by climate change, by ecological harms. The ear has been listening, has been to the very forces that are creating the harms. For example, politicians appear to be shoe-shine boys for the transnational corporations. Whatever the corporations say is the gospel truth, must be accepted. Is investing is a way to create jobs, to bring foreign direct investments. All kinds of reasons are made to allow them to continue as outlaws, economic outlaws, climate outlaws, and they go without any sense of responsibility except to publish those beautiful, those so-called sustainability reports, and to carry out what they term corporate social responsibility, which is actually marks of irresponsibility, because you can't damage my environment and then build me a hospital. I can be healthy if I live in harmony with my environment. I don't need artificial drugs to compound my dependency on a corporation that is actually killing me. So we've got so much harm done because also it is believed that technology can fix almost any kind of problem. And so people talk about, for example, genetically engineering crops to produce enough food for people. And then people believe the myth that genetically engineered crops actually can be more nutritious, can taste better, can yield better. But we've seen from empirical results by scientists, but not all scientists are going that way, have shown that at best, in terms of productivity, the difference is not much. The difference can be either way. And so it's not really, this kind of engineering solutions would not eliminate hunger in the world. For over 20 years, more than 20 years, this engineering pattern has been going on, and yet hunger has been increasing, and more people are being malnourished or obese or having one kind of problem, nutrition problem or the other. And now the increasing clamor is that we should go the pathways of agroecology, working with nature, planting with nature. And this is what our peasant farmers have been doing, helping to cool the planet by having multiple crops on the same plot of land and having soil cover, protect, building healthy soil, not soil destroyed by herbicides and pesticides and all kinds of chemical agrotoxics, artificial fertilizers. And so there are solutions already, but capital is always looking for ways of changing the imagination of the people and then forcing people to accept solutions that accept pathways that are not really a solution. Then secondly, with regard to global warming, as Ashish mentioned, net zero has suddenly become a very popular term. And we're going to hear more of it in Glasgow later on this year. Nations, if a corporation has shown that within the next 20 years, 50 years, they're going to have achieved net zero, which doesn't mean zero really. It doesn't mean that they've stopped polluting. It just means that they have a mathematical way of showing that they can take care of what, sorry, I just had power failure. So, so that they could, you know, they could continue to pollute, continue to create, to harm the environment while pretending to take action that kind of offset what they've done. And so we we continue to count the molecules, talk about the molecules in the atmosphere, not the molecules of carbon in the ground. And so when the solution is given very clearly that the best way to go way forward is to leave fossil fuels in the ground, we continue to be, well, people are saying, well, you know, technology is going to bring the solution. We can continue to pollute and then we can capture. So you have this fantastic geoengineering or climate engineering solutions of whitening the clouds to reflect radiation into the atmosphere, placing sunshades in the sky, genetically engineering crops to become white, to have white leaves that would reflect radiation back, or to become more efficient in terms of photosynthesis to absorb more carbon. We hear about ocean fertilization, and then we hear about direct carbon capture and storage. And all these are not in any way going to stop the emissions they're going to stop global warming, going to stop the dependence on fossil fuel, but it's going to delay action. In other words, we don't care really what happens to the future, what happens to our children, grandchildren, and those who will be living in hundreds of years from now. But we're just concerned with only what happens today, not what happens in 5 years. Even at this time, where we see that we are really at the brink, we still celebrate agreements like the Paris Agreement. And what's the target there? 1.5 degrees Celsius or way below 2 degrees. I don't know what lies between 1.5 and 2.2 degrees. It's not much of a gap for me to have that, to see that as being ambitious. And then suddenly, when we look at the nationally determined contributions by nations, the aggregation of all the suggestions of contribution, they're going to make sure that we are hitting above 2 degrees or maybe even 3 or 4 degrees, which means that if those suggestions and determinations by countries based on national interest, not global interest, not planetary interest, we're setting the planet on fire. And so these are just some of the problems. We can talk about this all day, but it's really, really very sad that rather than following the real solution, going back to nature, working with nature, or keeping the fossils in the ground, we're still thinking that we can keep going on the burning spree. It's like setting your house on fire just because you have a fire extinguisher in your hand. Doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well said, Nnimmo. And I think, this technology being a solution, one of the flaws that I saw in the Bernie Sanders Green New Deal, which is otherwise a very interesting document, certainly compared to what mainstream politicians have come up with in the US, is path-breaking in many ways. But one of the things that surprised me, or maybe it shouldn't surprise me, was that they're talking about replacing fossil-fueled cars with electric cars. Now, that might or might not be of some benefit to climate, I have no idea. But it certainly does not solve, for instance, the biodiversity loss that is entailed in the incredible amount of mining that will be needed if entire US shifts to electric cars, or the whole world shifts to electric cars. So unless we're actually challenging also the fundamentals, again, going back to what is it that we mean when we say human beings should be living well? Does it mean that all of us need to have private vehicles? Or does it mean that, yes, we need some good public transportation and we need some mobility, but it's not something that, we should not be zipping around the world in our own private vehicles or airplanes or whatever, because there's no way, absolutely no way in which renewable energy, electric cars, etc., can be sustainable if consumption levels keep going up. The second thing I think about technology also is that given the fact that much of the technological so-called advancement, I don't call it advancement, I would say regression, has been extremely destructive, is also because who's controlling it? It is not, like you said, it's people are hardly participating in this. It's controlled by corporations or governments. And this is why, for instance, we see that the technology to cut down a tree, let's take a simple example. Cutting down a tree in a rainforest, one of those massive things that has grown over the last 2,000 years or, would take 5 people, maybe a few days to do with an axe. Today, you can cut down the same tree in 5 minutes using the latest technology that's available. Who has developed those technologies? Not the people living in the forest. it's people like us or corporations who actually want to cut down those trees for whatever their profit making is, and for consumers like us. So the enormous power of technology that we have today is something that is, I think, has to be questioned. And unless we democratize the development of or the use of technology, that's not going to happen. We don't even know the impacts of many of the technologies that we are developing. If you take, for instance, chemicals that are in use, I mean, we should be scared, we should be worried, sick, and panicking about the fact that toxics in some of the plastics that we use are halving the sperm count in men across many parts of the world. And this is not just in the global north. I was kind of having some perverse satisfaction when I first read that, but then I just saw a report saying in India the same thing is happening. So what sense does it make for us to be creating these sorts of technologies that's actually rebounding on us so bad? And finally, I think one of the important things also is that a lot of this technology, this is not about being anti-technology, but the kinds of technologies that are being developed are also such that it's alienating us from ourselves and from friends and social relationships. People are so hooked up on looking at the screen these days. There's that famous photograph, I don't know if you've seen it, of I think it's in the Louvre, in the Louvre Museum in Paris, a bunch of about 20 young people who are in the museum, and there's a famous Rembrandt or one of those paintings at the back, and they're all actually sitting and looking at their cell phones. Now, there's a sense of alienation from each other and from ourselves, including, for instance, how many of these technologies create the sort of convenience which makes us even forget how to use our hands or our bodies. Yeah, making things in the kitchen, for instance, doing with the hand, is now everything is done with electrical appliances. So there's all of these sorts of personal to social to global alienation that these technologies, I think, bring, and we need to really question that. I think, Philippe, you also asked about court rulings, and I'm sure Nnimmo will also have something to say about that. My perspective on this is that, yes, I think we're getting some very progressive judgments in national or international courts. For instance, the one recently from the German court on climate, or many judgments on rights of nature, which have come in different parts of the world, including India, for instance, recently had on the rights of the Ganga and the Yamuna rivers. Many other countries have had that kind of thing. But what I think is very important is that these judgments really will remain only on paper unless there is a mobilized public. So it's not a panacea, again, it's like technology. It's not a panacea to have these judgments. They're very good tools, and it's good that they're there. But unless there's a public that can make sure that they get implemented, unless there's a public that actually protects the river, which now has rights by some judgment or because of some law, it really means very little. So I think we cannot move away from the fact that the fundamental thing of political mobilization, social mobilization, and mind shifts and heart shifts has to be at the base of any kind of solutions we want to look for. Nnimmo, you might have something on the court rulings, yeah?
Yes. Actually, yes. I think the court rulings are very important, especially on the climate cases that you mentioned. They point in the direction that business as usual should not continue. But I think also that is, when I consider the court cases, for example, of poor farmers and villagers from the Niger Delta in Nigeria suing Shell in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, and getting some positive rulings there, I think that really is also very encouraging in terms of environmental justice campaigns. But it's like, to me, it's like a deposit, payment of a deposit for harm already done. It doesn't in any way pay for the crimes that have been committed, because again, the corporations never really wait until they are found guilty. When they notice that they're going to be found guilty, they find a way to settle out of court so that they don't have that label guilty on their foreheads. They want to show that they are amenable to reason and could argue, discuss with the victims and settle matters. And so I'm saying that this is part payment, kind of deposit payment, because when the world began to discuss, when the Eighth Charter, for example, was drawn up, and the world began to look critically at the environmental issues, it was also on the table that rich industrialized nations would have to pay for the harm that they inflicted on poorer countries that have been exploited right from colonial period to the present. A kind of payment of ecological debt. To me, that would be the time for almost full payment. I mean, you cannot really pay for environmental damage because it's difficult to restore a mining pit to what it was before mining took place in that place. But it would be much deeper payment than talk about climate finance, that nobody's willing to put anything on the table. People are putting grants and loans, calculating those as climate finance. Payment of ecological debt or climate debt would be much more fundamental and would be an incentive for change of behavior, for understanding that you would have to pay for any harm that is actually inflicted. But the court rulings are very, very important. And I find it very interesting, for example, that farmers and villagers in Zambia can sue a corporation in the UK for contaminating their rivers. This kind of helps people to see the depth of the crisis and how it affects human life, affects community life, and affects the future of future generations if nothing is being done. And this is, at this point, I think also we should acknowledge that some countries have included the rights of nature in their constitution, like Ecuador and Bolivia. They may not be implementing it to the letter of that law, but at least it's recognized and it's right there. And now many countries and groups are beginning to consider making ecocide, recognizing the crime of ecocide, with extensive damage to the environment, to extensive ecological damage, to raise that to a crime at the same level as war crimes, as crimes against humanity, and other such crimes at the Rome Statute before the International Criminal Court. If that really kicks in and that crime is recognized, it would be a big tool, a very useful tool for people who have been exploited, whose environments have been damaged, and they found no way to challenge such harms. I think that's something positive that should be coming.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe then we can move one step ahead of this in terms of looking at the future after COVID. In that sense, are there theoretical, practical model practices which you would want to see societies recovering from the pandemic using to avoid the return to development or business as usual, whatever we've had until now? And are there any practices that are grounded in existing realities that could help us in creating or imagining these different futures?
Ashish.
Nnimmo, I don't know whose turn it is. Okay.
I called you first.
All right. Philippe, I think, this is something that we've been working on for the last few years in India and elsewhere, is to document grounded initiatives which are showing the kinds of alternatives that already exist. These are not up in the air. They're actually there on the ground already. Whether it's to do with Nnimmo mentioned agroecology as an example, and that's an umbrella term, but there are hundreds of different ways by which people are producing adequate food for themselves. Food sovereignty, for instance, is a growing movement where people are saying that we will produce food in ecologically sustainable ways, but that we will also be in control of everything to do with food. The land, the knowledge, the seeds, the water, whatever it is. So we don't allow corporations and governments to control our lives. And there are many examples of that from different parts of the world. You can say the same thing. There's water sovereignty movements, and energy sovereignty movements of decentralized renewable energy, which has a much smaller impact. But also going into, these are basic needs, but also going into things like alternative health, alternative learning, governance, direct democracy. I mean, for instance, we have At a large scale, we have the examples of the Zapatista in Mexico and the Kurdish ecofeminist movement in Western Asia, which if you look at the Kurdish movement, it's incredible because it's in the middle of the most war-torn part of the world, the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey border area where the Kurdish ethnic community is. And for hundreds of thousands of people, they're actually trying to implement over the last 25, 30 years, a very direct, radical, eco-feminist democracy. So it's ecologically based, it's based on everybody having a voice, not just the Kurdish, but also the other ethnic communities there, and women fighting for equality and equal rights. And so you actually, and there are many, again, other examples like that. So if you were to actually take this, what I can do maybe after Nnimmo also responds to this is to show you something we call the flower of transformation, which is looking at multiple different spheres of or aspects of transformation that are happening in different parts of the world. But of course, much more that needs to be done to create that kind of holistic change and create what we call here we're calling eco-Swaraj, which means, or loosely translated, a radical ecological democracy, where democracy is about people claiming power where they are, not handing it over to elected officials and politicians and so on, and definitely not to private corporations, but saying that power is inherent in us, where we are, in our village community, in our urban neighborhood, in our educational institution, whatever we're in, that we will exercise that power, but we will exercise it in a way that's responsible towards everybody else and all other species. So it's a very different kind of thing from the liberal democracy we have right now, which says, I'm going to try and vote a government in power which will hopefully do the right thing for me. And then if it doesn't, wait another 5 years and vote some other party in power and hope that they will do the right thing for me. Instead of that, what these communities are saying, no, we are the government in our village, or we are the government in our urban neighborhood, and we will be the ones taking the decisions, but we will do it in ways that are responsible. So I think there's I'm going to put a link in the chat. I just wrote an article in Scientific American with many such examples of the kind of amazing transformations that people are making for all these different spheres. Nnimmo, over to you, and then if Philippe, if there's time, I'm going to come back to show you that flower of transformation.
Okay, thank you so much. I believe you've basically responded to the idea that Philippe put across about different ways that people are already doing things or thinking or theoretically preparing. And in recent times, personally spent a lot of time in communities, sitting down to listen to their stories and trying to figure out what are the dreams and what are the challenges and what is the way of alternative ways of organizing that would respond to the real needs of the people and actually work in their interest. And I think this is what we can pick up all those signals. There are different autonomous ways of doing things, of planning, of acting that actually have a lot of commonalities based on local cultures, national culture, regional ways of organizing that can actually come together to help transform the world in a way that is more respectful of others, without only looking as though we are the ones who are correct and others are not correct. And that to me is a very positive way of learning. But one challenge I've found personally in listening, of course, many at the grassroots people they're used to not being listened to. So when you really deliberately sit to listen, it opens up spaces to hear so many things that you would otherwise not hear. And I find that the stories sometimes the preconceived notions of what we believe people really want are totally wrong. It's not because people really, they know what they may not have the space to declare, to say what they want to the wider audience because nobody's listening, but they do have clear ideas of what they want, and it's democratic in a sense, not as Ashish mentioned, not in terms of elections, not in terms of something that is done in 4 years, or you negotiate and form alliances in terms of for political power, but things that are much more organic, things that are much more fluid, things that consider not just humans, but also other beings that we share this physical space with. In fact, things that we share the spiritual space with. And so it's much more holistic the way people want actually organizing. And I think this is why we collectively could say that humans are very resilient, and that's why we see surviving on the planet. Because if capital and political powers had their way, I believe that many regions in the world would have been without humans, at least by now.
Okay, so sorry, yeah. Philippe, can I show that?
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, so can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, this I'm just putting up partly because just to show some of the kinds of radical alternatives that are already taking place in different parts of the world. And by the way, I love this map. If any of you think it's upside down, think of the fact that the planet is round, so it depends on where from space you're looking at it. And also the so-called normal map, where Europe was on top, was done in colonial times to show Europe on top and to show Europe as being much bigger than it actually is. And here you can see Nnimmo's continent is actually the biggest one, much bigger than what you see. Huh?
This is the correct map.
Yeah, this is the decolonial map. But also, and of course, and the book which you see on the top right-hand side has 100 examples of radical alternatives from different parts of the world. You can download it for free. I'll put the link there. But I want to show you this particular image, which is what we call the flower of transformation. So if you look at the kind of examples taking place in different parts of the world, they're really arguing for radical democracy. Like I said, people saying that we claim power where we are, rather than states or corporations dominating us in terms of political decision making. But that also leads to a very interesting thing of actually questioning even nation-state boundaries. And Nnimmo can speak much more about this than I can, but I mean, certainly in South Asia, a lot of the national boundaries are accidents of colonial history. And Africa is the worst possible example of that, which Nnimmo, I'm sure you can. Now, so what that has done, what these nation-state boundaries in the current political kind of thing, and we all think that nation-states are like God-given truth, whereas they're only 200 years old or 300 years old. They've cut ecological contiguity, they've cut rivers, they've cut mountain ranges, and they've cut cultural exchanges that used to take place before these nation-state boundaries were made. So radical democracy would then actually entail questioning a lot of the current liberal democracy and nation-state basis that we have, including therefore then also the United Nations, which put so much power in the hands of national governments. The second part on the right-hand side is economic democracy. Arguments, for instance, for food sovereignty are arguing about economic democracy, or what we were talking about, technology. Who controls technological development? Who vets whether a particular technology should or should not actually go ahead? Is very much part of economic democracy. Who controls the means of production? Why should capitalists be controlling the means of production and not workers themselves? Because they're the ones putting in all the work, not the capitalists. And also then the economy becomes one of caring and sharing. It's really about, including the completely invisibilized economic role that women play, for instance, in taking care of children or the elderly, or in so many other ways, the economy of production and reproduction. Then there's social justice, because we should never forget the fact that there is gender inequalities, class and racism, casteism in India, and many others. And the struggles against that are also very much part of this transformation. Nnimmo, I'd like you to speak more also on the culture and knowledge bit, because I think the whole issue of decolonizing knowledge has to be also very much part of this. Why should we think of only modern science and technology as being the valid knowledge? Why not so many other forms of knowledge that we've actually had across the world? And finally, of course, ecological resilience is something that we're all talking about, sort of putting ourselves back into nature rather than thinking of ourselves as apart from it. The next slide I'm going to maybe come back to later, which is where I think something that's probably common as against the kind of, not against, but within the incredible diversity of things that are happening all over the world is a set of values. But I'm going to come back to this maybe a bit later. Nnimmo, maybe you want to share on knowledge, culture, and any other aspects.
I think I was enjoying your presentation. I don't know why you stopped there. You should have just continued. That was very rich. Thank you so much. Indeed, we have the diversity. The world is very rich, and we're so diminished by ignoring the diversity that we have. That's where our resilience is. That's where our capacity is as a species to make real progress. And yeah, the cultures of knowledge, cultures of resistance also, which is one big way our communities have been able to defend the planet, to defend the rivers, defend the mountains, defend the forest from forces of extraction and exploitation. And this is based on a rich cultural connection to nature, because people do really know that nature is our mother. And if anything happens to any part of nature, it means that we are diminished because our relatives are being harmed or destroyed. And there's so much knowledge also, not the knowledge that you may find in schools, in universities, in academic circles. And this is something that we really need to place some emphasis on. We have to go back to the roots. We've been having schools of ecology, but as we pursue that approach, we find that we are much more enriched if we don't just depend on the kind of things that we'll be talking about. What we imagine would be the way forward, but really to listen to those who are the custodians of the culture, people who are custodians of values, people who are living in harmony with nature, living close to nature, taking only what they need and not taking things just because they can grab it. This is real sustainability of people who are living the culture of diversity, culture of solidarity, and cultures of resistance as ways of life.
So I think, Philippe, one of the things that sort of emerges from what Nnimmo and I are saying is that if you're looking at recovery, post-COVID recovery, unfortunately, most governments are trying to just go back to the pre-COVID days. So putting investments into banks and aviation industry and all of that. So it's a sort of desperate attempt to hold up a system that's been collapsing for quite some time. Whereas, in fact, if we were to learn from these amazing examples on the ground, I mean, in India now we've done a series called The Extraordinary Work of Ordinary People Beyond Pandemics and Lockdowns, which is 60 stories, and it's more coming in, of where communities have shown resilience through the COVID period for food, health, livelihoods, etc., because they had adopted a very different approach, the kind of approach we're talking about, like food sovereignty as an example. So if governments are really serious, which unfortunately mostly are not, but if they are, or if we want to push for policy shifts in the post-COVID recovery packages that we're talking about, we need to argue for supporting those kinds of true self-reliance and localization, which is very different from trying to pump up the banks and pump up the big industries and so on. Obviously, very hard to do. But if we really want to change course, as we must, and avoid the next huge crises, then we have to be able to orient our economy and politics in that direction. So what I've been calling a rainbow recovery rather than just a Green New Deal or a green recovery. Multiple different transformations and revolutions.
Okay, maybe picking up on that, you've both talked about both broad, large ideas in terms of what we need to move away from, where we need to move towards, and also about specific ways in which things can be changed. But now maybe one of the things that we would benefit from in terms of you being from two different regions of the world that share a lot, but also have lots of differences among them, is what are the kind of things that each region can offer to the world, to the other region? Okay, if we just talk about South Asia and Africa in general, or West Africa, and maybe also a little bit of how much the global South can be can help the world in terms of the South and the North in terms of moving forward.
Okay, I'll take the first stab at that. I believe that really at this point, it should be clear to the world that the solution to the crisis, global crisis that we're having is already available in the global South. After so many centuries of exploitation, of destruction, and the resilience that we've seen, this has been possible because there is a much more restrained way of relating with nature. And unfortunately, we have to, fortunately for us, we can learn from this, and everyone should be ready to pull the brakes. We simply cannot continue the way we are continuing. Even if we talk of electric cars or renewable energy, to have the notion that whatever is being invented today would maintain life, would maintain the same pattern of production and consumption is wrong thinking. It's got to go beyond that. It's much more systemic. It's not about producing the equivalence of what we are seeing today. It's about going to producing what is actually needed and what is the way that can be sustained to the future. Because if you want to produce green energy to keep the same level of production and consumption, then we're going to still need more than one planet. The resources for green energy still need to be mined. You're going to go to more mining in Congo, pollute the environment, displace people, create more crisis, more violence, more conflict. And right now, even wind energy is causing some land crisis in northern Kenya, where you have the biggest wind farm on the continent. The biggest solar farm on the continent is in Congo, is in Morocco. We also know that there are social crises related to that also. And so we need to come to a nature's level of doing things that are within certain limits. It means also reimagining our lives and being willing to redefine what, as Ashish has mentioned many times, what is well-being, what are we looking for on earth? What kind of life do we want to live? How do we measure well-being? Is it by the size of our bank account? Or is it by how we relate to our neighbors, how we relate to our community, how we relate to Mother Earth? What does it mean to be, to live well? In my language, you call it etuwem. Etuwem means good living or good life. And it's not measured by what you have or who you are. It's about how you are with your people. It's almost close to what in South Africa is called Ubuntu. And what the Latinos call buen viver, or something similar. So we already have a thread of this philosophical and cultural way of living, the basis for our action that cuts across. And you can find this in the global north also. You find it in the First Nation communities. You find it in even where people have ignored or pretended they don't remember. They've lost the memory of what life used to be. We have to go back to the past in order to construct the future. Then from there, we can look back on how to make the pathways to where we really want to get to. Otherwise, we're going to be surprising ourselves every inch of the way. But we've seen enough of the building blocks that have been there, that are already there, that we ought to construct on. And be more deliberate about curtailing our appetites for what we don't need.
Yeah, and I think I think there's one of the problems because of colonialism is that we tend to, if Africa and West and South Asia have to interact, they go through Europe. So we have to find ways of the global South being able to interact with each other much more than has been the case before, because there is a lot that we can learn from each other. I mean, for instance, from what little I know of the African continent, there's some most amazing initiatives coming up about, for instance, from South Africa, 1 million climate jobs. You know, how do you revive the economy in such a way that jobs or employment is being created, but it's being created in a way that also helps to solve the climate crisis. You can do that with across the whole range of economic sectors, right? Similarly, in South Asia, I think we have some very innovative stuff happening on sustainable, on food sovereignty, as an example, on radical democracy, as an example, and maybe, you know, Africa, some learnings can go there. So there's a lot of cross learning that can happen. But I think what's important here is, it's not about, people often ask me, okay, how do you replicate, let's say, the Kurdish Rojava thing or the Zapatista or some of the examples from India that I can give, and or how do you upscale them? And my response has always been that replication and upscaling is a government or a corporate strategy. What we need is what I call outscaling, which is to say, learn the principles of these initiatives, learn the processes that they've done, and the values and the ethics that are emerging in these examples, and then apply them in our own context. And this is where I want to put, again, if I might put that other slide I was going to show, sorry, not this. Because I think the most important thing really is this, is what are the worldviews that we're actually that are coming out of these sorts of initiatives. Some have sustained, like Nnimmo mentioned, you know, many from his Nnimmo. What's the word you use for the Nigerian well-being notion?
Well, Nigeria has about 250 languages. In my
in your language, okay.
In my language, this is etuweb. I'll write it in the box.
Okay, great. Yeah, and like he said, you know, Ubuntu or Buenvivir or Sumak Kause, or here we call it Swaraj in Bangladesh, Shohaj. There's lots of them. Pluriversal, the book has 30 or 40 of those examples. But what I think is common to these worldviews, which are really about celebrating life, not celebrating money and power and fame, is this set of values. Now, this is just a small set. I'm sure everybody here can add many more to it. But to me, these ethics are fundamentally in opposition to what the currently dominant system tells us. If you take the number fourth bullet point there, all through school, when I was doing my schooling, I was told you have to come first. Competition, and you know, you have to compete with everybody else in your class. But these examples that are really showing the world what sustainable and equitable living can be are about cooperation. We're told private property is the thing to aspire for. But these examples of transformation are talking about the commons, right? About solidarity. And we know that during the COVID period, the ones that survived the best were the ones which were able to express and show solidarity with each other. If you were left alone, you had a really tough time. So, or we you know, Nnimmo spoke about rebuilding our relationship with the rest of nature. So if you take the fourth last bullet point there, and which you mentioned earlier with regard to Ecuador and many judgments, is rights not just of human rights, but the rights of the rest of nature also, which many traditional communities have always held, not in legal terms, but in their cultural forms, non-violence in many different ways. So to me, it seems like what we need to do much more across the global South, but also with the global North, is to share these ethics and how we can actually live them or relive them. And I'm also glad to say that even from the belly of the beast, so to speak, the industrialized nations, you know, things are coming out. Degrowth, as an example, or ecofeminism, as an example, from the industrialized societies. They're also realizing that the way they've gone so far, there's something fundamentally wrong, and they have to change course in a very, very basic and systemic way.
Maybe before we open for Q&A, just one last question, again, going broader. What would be your vision for the 2020s in broader terms that we can all learn from? Nnimmo, I know you said you had something to say on that.
Yeah, with the last slide that Ashish just showed, I think we can paint a picture of the next of the future, starting from right now.
Nnimmo, I'm going to send you that slide, and I want a poem from you because you are a poet.
Oh my goodness! Don't put me on the spot. Yeah, I really believe that. I don't know who said it, but I think the university that we must all go through is the university of the streets. We have to be on the streets. We have to build solidarity. Yeah, and this is the connection that we have that we can make across. And we have people in every nation, virtually every nation, I would say every region of the world, who are very concerned about what is going on, about the ecological damage, the political crisis, the social crisis, financial crisis, food crisis. And there are people who are really concerned about contributing to resolving this thing. And so if peoples of the world were to meet together, we'll quickly find a solution, just like we were able to come up with the charter, the draft declaration for the rights of Mother Earth at the meeting in Cochabamba in 2010, within just a few days, something that multilateral system would take several decades to try to achieve. And so the peoples of this world already know what the pains, and they know they have the solutions, and we need to have greater solidarity. We have to find ways of connecting. The pandemic has kept people from traveling, which in a certain sense is a good thing. Now we can meet together without having to travel. So we can also use these means and other similar means to build and strengthen solidarity, share ideas, and really emphasize on our commonalities and the ways that we can change the system that needs to be changed. System change cannot remain a slogan. We have to get it done. We have to get it done by being immersed in local political action and local social organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well said. The University of the Streets, or of the, I guess, of the forest and the land and the coasts and the farms and so on. I think one of the problems we face is that there's a lot of fragmentation amongst the resistance and alternative movements around the world. We need to find ways to come together because the system we're up against is much more unified. The Davos World Economic Forum, they fight amongst each other, but they're still much more unified than we are as people who are challenging and questioning that and providing the alternatives. So I think we need that. And that's one of the reasons why we initiated also this modest effort at trying to bring movements, global movements on radical alternatives together, the global tapestry of alternatives. Nnimmo is also very much part of that. And so the idea is not to create a top-down hierarchical structure or a super organization, but just a bridge, a platform in which we can be able to share, collaborate, create more of a critical mass, create more of a mass sort of advocacy challenge and so on. And also collective dreaming. I think the power of dreaming is something that we've lost. Daydreaming of what is the society we want, what's the vision that we're looking for, because that's what will guide us in the paths that we take, the utopian visions. I don't think we should be scared of those, as long as we also have our feet on the ground. And so I think I would say the 2020s, hopefully and beyond, we would be able to see much more of this kind of global solidarity and coming together to challenge and change the fundamentals.
Okay, maybe this is the point at which we should open up for comments, questions from our audience. I know there's been some sort of a discussion in the chat before, but I think that was over. So you're welcome to ask, either raise your hand or put questions in the chat or comments. Yeah, Divya, thing.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Ashish sir and Nnimmo sir, for this amazing conversation. It has triggered a lot of points in a way. But I had quite a few questions, and even I have been working with this whole idea of pluriverse and also radical ecologies and everything. And being a transition designer, I seek for all of these things. So I'm still a student, but it is more sort of that I had this particular question which was about how do you think that we can affect this pre-consumed mentality of that is driven by capitalism, and as we see that the technology, as you said, that it cannot be seen as a solution, but can the technology become a trigger, or and technology, when I'm talking about the immersive technologies or something like that, to trigger that memory of the past, to trigger that uh, the memories that we already have of the solidarity and everything, to for this particular idea of questioning our preconceived mentality that we have. So I just wanted to know if you can shed light upon that a bit.
I think before Nnimmo and I respond, Deviraj Singh, can you maybe give an example of what you mean by immersive technology?
Like virtual reality and stuff. That's what I'm talking about. Immersive technologies.
Okay. Nnimmo, you want to take that, or should I go ahead?
Please go ahead.
Okay, that's a tough one because I don't know very much about these immersive technologies. I think I used virtual reality only once and I was quite freaked out. But yes, I mean, I think if there are ways by which we can, and certainly, I mean, at least a part of the social media has been very powerful in, say a message is given from an Amazon indigenous person. It can go across the world in a few seconds, and that can be very powerful in questioning some of our fundamental beliefs and so on. And if you're saying that, okay, some of these technologies can also help us to relive things that were there in the past, simpler ways of living or whatever, then yes, perhaps these could be useful. But I think the important thing is, going back to the point that Nnimmo and I were making, is that technology cannot be the fundamental solution. Because you have to keep in mind that virtual reality and all of these other immersive technologies are also going to continue to be controlled by the corporations and the governments that will use them for their own power. We're seeing that with all the social media, right? And the way in which they can even distort elections in India and the US and elsewhere. So we can't get away from the fact that we have to challenge the concentration of power in the hands of corporations and the government, or men, if it's patriarchy, right? That without doing that, technologies will be useful, but they will always be more used by those who are currently in power. They're not neutral in that sense. So that's what my response would be. Nnimmo?
I don't really have much to add to that. It's just that one general thing I would like to say about technology is that technology must not be a fetish, and it must be democratized, it must be in service of the people. And so people have, the problem is that a lot of technology is moving much faster than regulation. And so it's very difficult for some things that are happening to be controlled before they get out of hand. While we don't want to curtail creativity and development and progress in that dimension, we also have to be ensured to make sure that whatever comes up supports life as we know it, and supports, and it's not destructive, so to speak.
Okay, next is singer Zainab.
Hello. Thank you, Nnimmo and Ashish, for an excellent conversation. I am a PhD student at SOAS, and I'm researching. My topic is food sovereignty in India mainly. So there's I had a lot to gain from what you said. My question is mainly directed to Ashish, but please, Nnimmo, feel free to step in. In the context of, I think in the broad context that you mentioned, that we understand the narrative, of the state and corporation kind of spaces on the one hand, vis-a-vis the community, localized, rural, if I may say so, those spaces. And there's this kind of conflict that we see in the larger world political economy. Now, in the context of food sovereignty, and in India more specifically, I mean, of course, there are excellent examples of successful food sovereignty movements and manifestations in different places. But my question really is, after doing a little bit of field work for my own PhD research, there's a conflict really in terms of when the communities themselves are so entrenched in capitalist thinking that their idea of progress and their aspirations in agriculture or agribusiness are very capitalistic. So when you ask members of the community, if someone is making good seed, they want to make a business out of that. And if someone's making good fertilizer, they want to make a business out of that and then make it bigger and bigger, accumulate more land and so on. So how can we foster or encourage greater food sovereignty that's more ecologically aligned in such contexts? And whether, I mean, do you see that as a contradiction in terms of, on the one hand, food sovereignty should be community led and from within the community? So we as environmentalists, if I may say so, should not be in a position of preaching the community to say that this is what is right for you and this is not what is right. Not, I mean, this is what you should be doing or this is what you should not be doing. So whether you see that contradiction in such communities that have capitalistic aspirations. And if I may say so, just one extra point, if you can reflect a little bit on, in having said that, if you can reflect a little bit on the recent farmers' protests in India. I mean, what is your reading of the situation? Whether you see that as a movement of food sovereignty, or is that really just again farmers with a certain kind of privilege taking on the government to secure their market systems, really to sort of perpetuate what the Green Revolution gave us? So if you wish to comment on that, that's up to you. So
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Zainab. And both questions are questions that dealing with them in a few minutes would mean being very simplistic. So apologies for that. But since you're working on the Indian situation, we can always continue the conversation later. So I think with regard to the fact that communities also, whether it's farmers or any other communities, also have either enter into the capitalist market or have the same aspirations that all of us in the industrialized, so-called modern world have, and it's not their fault, because that's what we've all been brainwashed into thinking, that if I was to earn more, it's better. If I was to have a bigger house, it's better. If I was to have my own car, it's better, etc., etc. And how else to do that but to enter into the global market chain? So that's a huge dilemma, undoubtedly. I think the way to deal with it, and at least where some places where I've seen successfully being dealt with, is not to go and preach anything at all. That doesn't, it's hypocritical for us to do that. It doesn't work anyway. But to say, okay, what is the ultimate desire that people have? To have a better life, let's say, okay, to have good earning, let's say, okay. Now, can we create a localized exchange which enables you to do the same thing and doesn't fall into the capitalist thing? And here I would actually also briefly respond to what Stephen has asked in the chat about the reimagining of markets without necessarily falling into the capital, because markets are not necessarily capitalistic. right? Markets have been around for ever since there has been exchange, thousands of years. So can we create, and we have many examples of that here, can we create a localized exchange? For instance, you know, the food sovereignty movement of the Dalit women in Telangana, the Deccan Development Society. Now, these Dalit women farmers have entered into a relationship with 100 consumer families in Hyderabad. It's a direct relationship whereby initial investment and then the families get organic food, but it also creates a social relationship in which the families visit the farmers visit them in Hyderabad, etc. And it's beyond the capitalist kind of thing. It is an exchange. It is also an exchange in which money is used, but it's not in the control of any kind of capitalist. It's the producer and the consumer directly interacting with each other. And so it actually enables a much better economic livelihood for these women without doing that. So the point I'm making is that creating those systems or helping or enabling those systems, either through policy shifts or through ground level decentralized initiatives like the one I just gave you an example of, is one way to break through the kind of hesitation or wall that you will otherwise face from communities who will want to enter the capitalist market. The second thing with regard to the farmers movement, very quickly, because again very complex, is that yes, the farmers movement is not necessarily a food sovereignty. The current farmers agitation is not necessarily a food sovereignty movement, but it is certainly a movement to safeguard livelihoods with respect to the increasing corporatization that is taking place of Indian agriculture. To say that corporations must not enter the agricultural sector. Now, there's a lot of discussion that's going on between the farmers' movements and other groups saying that by itself, even if the 3 laws that the Indian government has passed are withdrawn, and then the farmers go back to Punjab, Haryana, UP, wherever they come from, to go back to the old Green Revolution thing is not going to solve a lot of other problems. So that discussion is beginning. And I think the more we're able to have that discussion and say, here are alternative ways by which you can have a prosperous agricultural livelihood, but without chemicals or without these kinds of global market linkages, then I think we will be able to create a much bigger transformation than simply winning the war against these 3 laws and the corporatization of agriculture. But like I said, it's a very complex topic, so we can offline have more discussion on this. Thanks.
Let me just add a little bit to that. Thank you so much for your question, Zainab. And the problem about the way people look at farming and agricultural production is the same challenge that we have in Nigeria, in Africa, I would say broadly. People believe that for you to go into agriculture, you must be for the purpose of becoming a big business enterprise. And I think this is a very colonial notion, actually, that needs sovereignty campaigns.
I'm a researcher at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development.
Sovereignty campaigns can help to decolonize this kind of narrative, because colonialism brought on the issue of cash cropping meaning colonial plantation agriculture, where crops were cultivated not for local consumption but for export. And so the main concern of agriculture was for the export market, not for the local or regional market. And people still have that at the back of the mind, that whatever, if you're going to do well in your farming, you must produce things for export. Otherwise you are written off. And the world seemed to, when I say the world, I'm talking about governments and corporations, they quickly self-ignore the fact that the bulk of the food that people feed is the small-scale farmers, the smallholder farmers who are feeding the world, using the least amount of it, about 80% of the food that we eat, using less than 30% of the resources to produce this. And so how does this logic stick? It's a colonial mentality. We have to decolonize farming.
Thank you for these answers. The next person I think in line is Vivek.
Thank you, Nnimmo and Ashish, for the fascinating talk. I just want to, I just have this question to Ashish. You mentioned about this fragmentation among the pro-poor or pro-people aspirants, like movements, are fragmented amongst themselves. I think that fragmentation should be cured as fast as possible. I feel as a ecological science researcher who is working among farmers of Odisha state, evergreen revolution as a good umbrella platform to bring alternative farming systems together, because as Nnimmo said, these techno-fixes or engineering-based solutions, or in CS Halling, in CS Halling's terms, in the resilience thinker CS Halling terms, engineering resilience is equal to fail-safe technology, whereas ecological resilience is equal to safe fail technology. We need in agricultural system, adaptive learning is needed. For adaptive learning, it goes in trial and error basis. We keep on upgrading our knowledge. So there we need safe fail, not the fail safe, that is fail safe approach that is applied in engineering solutions. So based on this now, for the BT crops, even for the BT crops, people are suggesting that besides the BT cultivated crops, the refuge crops should be cultivated for the pest population. If refuge crop is not cultivated, BT toxin will lose its virulence towards the pest, because pest population is getting resistance. So again, the techno-fix is coming back to the foundational foundational methods in agriculture system, like mixed cropping, crop rotation, or refuge cropping. So that's where evergreen revolution calls for this foundational resilience that needs to be strengthened. So what do you think about evergreen revolution?
No, Vivek, I think, I mean, I agree that we need all those the characteristics that you gave about what you call the evergreen revolution. The thing is that it's called different things in different parts of the world, and we must not make the mistake of giving one name to the incredible diversity of we call it agroecology or sustainable agriculture or indigenous agriculture, or what you're calling evergreen. So because we made that mistake with the green revolution, and in fact we're also making that mistake even with solutions. That we, oh, this is a great solution, let's export that all over the world. So it's really the fundamentals of what we mean by that. And apart from all the things you said, I think one of the most important things, and going back to the previous question and adding to what Nnimmo said, see, the same Dalit women I was talking about, they have a principle, a very core principle. They will sell in the market, but only after their domestic food security is met. Only after the children, all the family members are met, their cattle are fed, everything is then only if there is surplus will they sell in the market. Now that becomes a very crucial thing, because otherwise what happens also is that in the name of agricultural development, enhancing livelihoods, enhancing incomes, blah, 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 we have seen disastrous things happening where a product that is locally consumed gets commercialized, and yes, the family earns more money, but they themselves can't afford to use that anymore because it's part of a global market, right? So, and if you're doing that with food or water or basic things like that, milk, then that's a disastrous way to go. So, so these fundamental principles have to be there, and they're there in many of the agroecological movements around the world.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much.
Nnimmo, anything else? No. Then the next person is Adaura.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Ashish and Nnimmo, for your sessions. But I have just a simple question, which is something that has been on my mind. When Nnimmo was speaking, he had mentioned, he had made mention of the ecological debt. that is owed, especially to the South. And this is something that is ignored in the North-South relationships that exist in terms of new concepts that keep coming up and proposals that keep coming up. And I'd just like to ask, what in your own what would you think would be your proposal for how this debt will be paid? Would it still be paid economically, or is it just by a hands-off approach of changing the way we relate to the environment? What would you say is the best proposal for how this debt can be paid?
Thank you, Adora, for that simple but complex question. The big challenge about having ecological debt paid is that, as you must know, has been kind of waved offhanded. The powerful nations of this world can choose what to respect and what to consider, what to discuss and what not to discuss. Just the same way some countries totally ignore the International Court of Justice, and they can commit any kind of crimes they want to, and nobody's going to hold them accountable. And so the exploitation of the world, exploitation of the environment, and exploitation of peoples, whether in slavery, in colonialism, which is continuing today in any case, because not every state is liberated. And so the exploitation by transnational corporations who have more or less made politicians to govern nations or govern territories on their behalf. These are the real forces behind politics. And so they get into pay. The ecological debt can be, there are many ways this can be done. Countries require finance to do certain things, of course, so it has to be, this is one instance where I will agree that we should use monetary terms in terms of figuring out how much harm has been done, understanding that it cannot fully pay for the harm. And then we've also heard about polluter pays principle, but I don't think that also does not pay for the pollution, because the harm is something that cannot be computed in terms of cash. But these are things that should be demanded, recognized, computed, and paid for. At a certain level, it would change the notion of who is a poor country and who is a rich country, because highly indebted countries are not necessarily those ones that the World Bank says these are the poor countries. No. You have the richest country in the world today may also be the poorest country, actually, because everything is based on exploitation and on paid debts, unrecognized debts, and so I don't know whether I don't think I can give you a direct answer. Maybe Ashish will have to give a more direct response to this, but recognizing the fact that this debt is there, that needs to be paid, to me is a significant step. And then secondly, removing the smoke screen from things like climate finance, which from 2010 to 2020 was to be $10 billion a year. And from last year onward, it's going to be 100 billion. And we don't see any of these targets being met. Now that will be exposed to be totally insignificant. And to me, this would be a step forward.
Just a couple of additional points there. I think one is that if there is true recognition of ecological debt, then one of the first things would be to wipe off the so-called economic debts that countries have, because it's way much smaller than the ecological debt if put in economic terms, like Nnimmo was saying. So that's one. But the second thing is that ecological debt continues to be the case. It's not only in colonial times. There is still a massive ecological debt that the global north has towards the global south. If you look at the current consumption of resources, for instance, or the climate space or the biodiversity space that the global north is using, it's way bigger than what the global south is using. In that sense, the debt is continuing. It is a continuous everyday kind of thing. So recognizing that and saying, look, one of the first things you need to do, past reparations and all of that is important, but the present debt that you are incurring, the only way to stop that is to challenge the ecological footprint that you as in the global north has. Scandinavia thinks of itself as being ecologically extremely sensitive, and some of the so-called happiest nations of the earth, etc. But if you look at their ecological footprint across the world, it's enormous. So how can anybody say that that's a sustainable or moving towards a sustainable society? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So let's all people in Scandinavia be aware of that and say, if we really truly believe ourselves to be ecologically conscious, we have to contain and severely reduce our consumption and production patterns. And that's where the degrowth movement, for instance, in Europe does make sense. It may not make sense in a lot of other parts of the world, but in Europe or North America, the global north, it makes an enormous amount of sense. So I think that needs to be also built into the discussions on ecological debt.
I was just going to come to the questions in the chat, and Stephen, you were the first one, so if you can speak to your questions, it's probably better than.
Sure, thank you very much. A wonderful session. I really appreciate both of your perspectives. I've followed Ashish for a long time with the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and they're doing such great work. And my questions were about capitalism, which we're all struggling with or against in some ways, and reform, and what democratic socialism might mean. But Ashish, I asked about markets and the solidarity relationships in markets, and how do you do that in a globalized world, or with products like computers or phones, but not even that, products like refrigerators. I mean, you need these products, and how do we make them in an alternative future
Mira, señor, ¿dónde está?
Manageable or livable, living well? What does that mean? And I guess the bottom line is capitalism as a system, but even the idea of markets and how living well can be implemented in an alternative world. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Stephen. I mean, I guess one thing that we should get out of the way is that there's no way capitalism can be sustainable or equitable. So I think probably most of us on this call would agree with that. So, this green capitalism and green growth and all of that is, to my mind, nonsensical. Okay, yes, but markets will remain, exchange will remain. And so how do we deal with the issue of inequality or unsustainability of that kind? I think it goes back to the issue of what is need. Nnimmo raised this earlier. You're saying refrigerators. Now, I have lived in a tropical country, in a tropical climate, without a refrigerator for the last 15 years. I'm still very much alive. I don't feel deprived. At what point in time did something become a need when earlier it was luxury is also very much part of the way capitalism works. A car in the US is a need. It's almost like a fundamental need. I don't know whether it's built into the Constitution. I'm sure they would if they could. But it's not, as we know, right? So what real needs? Okay, food, water, housing, shelter, good education, good quality health, a voice in decision making, social relationships, etc., energy. Why cannot most or all of this be met in a localized region? Why do we need global trade for these things? You might still want to have global trade, let's say, for coffee. Yesterday, or not today, I think I read a report about how the climate crisis is going to impact Europe's coffee consumption, because you won't be able to get so much coffee anymore. But So some things we can still do this kind of global trade, maybe some textiles, maybe some, mangoes or whatever, I don't know. But for basic needs, there is absolutely no need, no reason why you cannot have. By localized, I don't mean every single village. You can have a certain region, depending on the area and the geography and the culture and the ecology. So, but that then means those fundamental changes in lifestyles, in what we think of as living well, etc. And then beyond that, if we have national or global trade, it must be of the kind that does not undermine this localized self-sufficiency and self-reliance. That becomes the core principle then. So if coffee is still being traded, it should not undermine my food sovereignty wherever I am. I will also maybe grow the coffee and send it to you, but without undermining my own food security and sovereignty. So I think those are the principles we're going to have to work towards, where then markets become, markets are in the service of people and environment and not in the service of profit makers or power seekers. Now, that's a very general answer. I know, Stephen, and obviously we don't have time to go into specifics, but I think there's a lot of examples of where this is beginning to happen. And wherever then you might still need global trade, you'd have to have things like fair trade. I think fair trade still has a lot of problems, but at least it's better than what we have, the so-called conventional trade. To look at building those principles of local democracy, of local sustainability, of local self-reliance, of fairness in remuneration, etc., into whatever trade still takes place. Nnimmo, you want to add?
Nnimmo, anything else?
No, I think that's probably, yeah, fully agree. So, yeah.
Okay, since I know that Nnimmo at least has to leave in the next 10 minutes, maybe we'll take the existing question in the chat as the last question. Ashish and Nnimmo, have you seen it, or do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, I've seen it. So yeah, when I first saw it, I thought, what a complex question, but I saw a lot of it is in brackets. So, so thank you for asking that. And I think we've more or less expressed our position with regard to this, the existing human cognitive behavioral biases. And in fact, I think they sometimes so generalized that we blame the entire human race for what just a few identifiable corporations are doing. And then we said this is anthropogenic. So really, like they say, you call a dog a bad name to hang it. But I think generally, because popular imagination and popular communications, there appears to be the dominant forces, of course, are not democratic, even if they call themselves that. They believe that humans have the right to, I mean, in terms of we don't really respect other species, but if we pay that more attention to the other species, we find that really we're not only dependent, we're not only interdependent, but really they are far more awesome than humans in terms of levels of creativity, levels of organization, and how they go about doing their things. So there's a lot to learn, and which humans require a big dose of humility to learn from other species, even from the smallest ants or fly. Only to learn a lot to behave, the way to change our behavior. And it's all this feeling of domination, of capacity to exploit and to consume and to satisfy whatever we believe we require at a particular time. This kind of notion is what is creating the harm that we see in terms of human relations to one another, in terms of international politics and everything else. And this is why we keep moving on that linear path that's leading to the cliff edge. And I believe that just a pause and a pause to review where we are with all sincerity, and also to recognize the fact that we can bring about the change that we need. That is what we really require this time. And if you permit me to mention what Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas said, that you don't really have to say, people always accuse, they make this question, what is your solution? What's your alternative? If I know that something is wrong, that is an alternative. If I know that something is dangerous, is bad, must be stopped, I've already given you a solution. And when we come to, if we all agree that something is wrong, or we all bring our alternatives, we find that we have a million ways to go around that problem. And this is what we need to do, to put all the solutions on the table, then we forge the way forward and move away from a damaging perspective and way of doing things.
Yeah, and I think, Sayantan, what you put in your brackets there, maybe I just sort of mildly challenge that, because you said since humans are cognitively predisposed to conquer and exploit nature, I think it's very difficult for us to say that, that is the truth, because you can also say humans are cognitively predisposed to work within nature. If you look at most of human history, I mean, the worldviews like eti um that Nnimmo has taught me a new phrase today. These sorts of worldviews actually were not really about conquest, no? They were about saying that we are one part of nature and we should have the humility to be one part of nature. We will, of course, use nature for our natural resources for our livelihoods, but we're not going to overexploit them or just use it for wasteful purposes. So if that can happen, and that is actually, I mean, I can just give you a quick example from a cluster of villages in central India where they now have full rights to use the forest under the, as you know, the Forest Rights Act in India. But they have taken a decision that that the patches of forest will be left completely alone for the wildlife and for the forest to just be by itself. And that there are certain species that they will not use because they realize that there are other species that are dependent on it. Now, whereas in fact they have the full power to exploit it fully and earn much more income from that. Now, these might, in the current situation, might be exceptions, because the current situation is one really of, what's the word, maximizing your benefits or whatever, the way capitalists have taught us. But the fact that they are there suggests that it is also part of human nature to be selfless and to not always think of conquest and so on. So how do we maximize or optimize the social conditions in which that part of human nature, the generosity, the solidarity, the selflessness can become the norm? That I think is what we need to really work towards.
Okay, I guess these last two answers provide a very good final point to this conversation. It's been an amazingly enriching 2 hours. Thank you both, Ashish and Nnimmo, and everyone else for participating and making the discussion very interesting on top of the original conversation. The session has been recorded, so in case there is anything you want to see again, we'll make it available on the website, but in case you want to have access to it separately, don't hesitate to email, because at least on the SOAS website it may not come up immediately. Is it Ashish Tapestry, where they ask for the recording?
Yeah, as soon as you make it available to us, we can put it up on the global
that will be by tomorrow. So on the that will definitely be a better. That will be a more immediate access to it. Okay. On this note, since at least I know that Nnimmo has to go by 3, I guess it's time to say goodbye and thank you everyone for participating. Thank you again, and hopefully see you again for another similar session.
Thanks, Philippe, for the opportunity. Thanks, Nnimmo. Hopefully soon again.
Thanks, everybody.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.